IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's episode of All Things Policy. We are 1 month into the new year, almost, and the most awaited event in the policy space is here. We're 2 days away from the union budget. As lay people, the few things we look out in the annual budget are mostly things related to income tax rates, tax cuts or increases on certain goods and services. And for the more discerning, maybe a few macro numbers like the fiscal deficit. But given this is the most important account of expenditure and income for the government, how can we as citizens make better sense of it? To understand the union budget, what it holds, how we can make better sense of it, I have with me my colleague Sarthak, who will help us understand this subject in a little more detail. Welcome, Sarthak. Welcome to the show.
Yeah, hi Suman. So before we start, just one thing: we're not 2 days because the day this episode is going to be released, it's going to be 31st of January. So
we're recording
tomorrow. The budget is going to be released.
Yeah. Okay. Firstly, why should we study the budget at all? From a public policy point of view, what are the interesting insights we can get?
Yeah. So the union budget, and in fact, with all the budgets, you get an idea about the intentions of the government, right? So the budget has details about how the government is going to spend its money, right? So you get to know about the intentions. And at the same time, the budget also tells you how the money was spent the last time and the last time. So you can look at those trends as well. So as someone who is interested in the public policy space, or just as a citizen, right, it makes sense for us to look into all these things, right? How your money, in fact, at the end of the day, this is mostly taxpayers' money, right? How this money is going to be spent on in which sector, on what scheme, right? So, and it can be a way by which you can also hold the governments accountable, in the sense that you can raise questions that why the money was spent on this and not this, right? So all these things can be understood and analyzed from the budget.
Yeah. So get an idea about the intentions of the government. Also, actually measure the government from what it said last time. The intentions that it said versus actions it actually did is what we can see in the budget. So what is usually covered in the Union Finance Minister's budget speech? We see that it becomes a big event in the news circles, and everybody is talking about it, and there is so much coverage about it. So what gets covered in the Union Finance Minister's budget?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, generally there is a lot of discussions, debates around what the Union Finance Minister says in the Parliament, right? The budget speech. So typically there can be some big announcements in a particular sector, or there can be a mention of a particular scheme. So all these things are there. Apart from that, sector-wise, what steps have been taken, and in the next year, right, in the upcoming fiscal year, what steps might be taken. So these kind of things are mentioned. And then there are a lot of numbers, right? This much we are going to spend, this percent increase in allocation is going to be there in this sector. All those things are there. And sometimes there is shero, shairi and all those things also that happens during the budget speech. But one thing I want to point out here is, given that this is going to be an interim budget, since the elections are supposed to happen this year, right? So this budget is going to be an interim budget. So maybe we might not have some big announcements, because ideally the government that is going to be there, right, after the elections, they should be having a major say in the expenditure and all those decisions. So maybe some big announcements might not be there, but you never know.
Yeah, but also this is a platform for the government to make an election speech, because we are not yet in the code of conduct or that election. So they might use this platform to make some announcements. But again, like you said, this is a vote on account and an interim budget. So we may just see an announcement and not actually outlays or expenditure set across for it. So is there anything apart from this? Like, what are the complementary documents, or what are some other things that we can read to make sense of the budget? Because the budget seems to have a lot of numbers, a lot of jargon, a lot of high-flown definitions and terms. How do we as citizens make sense of this? What are the things that we should read in parallel?
Yeah, thanks, Suman, for asking this question. Usually what happens, all the discussion mostly revolves around what the finance minister talks about in the parliament. What I would recommend is maybe go to the budget website. We'll share the link to the budget website. In the budget website, you will find multiple links to different documents. In fact, sometimes it can get a bit intimidating because there are so many things. But I'll just break it down into parts. You will have some sections which will talk about expenditure. Basically, how the government plans to spend money over the next year, and which department is going to spend how much amount of money, which ministry is going to spend how much amount of money, on what schemes this thing will be spent. So all these details you will get in the expenditure section. There will be multiple links. In fact, there will be some PDFs where you will get a summarized version of these as well. So in case you do not have enough time, you can go to those summarized versions. Depends on how much details you want, right? What granularity you are aiming to achieve. Then you also have the revenue section, right? Here you get an idea about how the government plans to raise revenues. Tax revenues, non-tax revenues, all those things are there. For here also you'll have summarized versions. Now, apart from that, I mean, these are the things which we usually talk about. But apart from that, there are some other documents also. For instance, there is this output outcome framework. So in this, you'll get an idea. What are the outputs and outcomes the government aims to achieve for different schemes, for different departments, right? So the expenditure part has the outlay. This much amount of money has to be spent. The output outcome framework will mention what you are going to achieve if you are spending this much amount of money. And this particular framework also talks about outcomes, long-term outcomes, basically. For instance, the expenditure part will have X amount that will be incurred on, let's say, something like Swachh Bharat Abhiyan. Output outcome framework will mention how many individual toilets will be set up, how many community toilets will be set up, and how many villages will become open defecation free because of this spending this much amount of money. So have a look at the output outcome framework as well. And apart from this, you also have implementation of budget announcements. So whatever announcements were made in the previous budget, last year's budget, how much of that has been implemented? So that document is also there. So maybe you can go through these documents and have some interesting questions, right? If you are saying that we initiated these things, then why does this not happen? So all those things, all these are basically prompts.
Yeah, just for our listeners, another probable example for the outlay output outcome framework is the education. So is the education sector spend or whatever. So if the government is saying that we will spend X amount of money in a particular year, outputs will measure how many school buildings or how many benches or how many teachers you will get on board. And outcomes is a long-term process where you're actually measuring, where you would probably measure the ability of students to read at a particular level or numeracy at a particular level. So that is an interesting framework that you should keep in mind when you're looking at budget numbers. So it's not just enough for us to be showing that we have spent or allocated that much money, but also to see what comes out of that allocation. This is where you will get some kind of an idea. So yeah, going forward, we always hear these words: budgetary, revised, actual. So what do all these mean? What are these important heads or categorizations of all these different budget documents?
Yeah, so if you look at these numbers, the documents that I was talking about right now, the expenditure documents related to expenditure, documents which have data on revenue and all those things, revenue estimates. So each document will broadly have four columns, four data columns, you can say. One will be the budgetary estimate for the upcoming fiscal 2024-25. So basically what the government intends to spend in the upcoming fiscal. Another column will be the budget estimates for last year. So budget estimate 23-24. So last year in the budget, what they announced, that is usually there. Then you also have the revised estimates for the previous fiscal. So you'll have the revised, this in the upcoming budget, you will have the revised estimates for 23-24. Right. So what would have happened is the government would have made some announcements in last year's budget. But it might so happen that the government overspends, or it might not spend or the different departments, ministries might not spend whatever they were allocated. So these estimates are revised. So usually after 6 months, you get an idea and you extrapolate that. So you also have the revised estimates for the previous year. And you have the actual spending data for last year. So in the upcoming budget, you're going to have the actual expenditure of 22-23. So actual expenditure of 2023 on different departments, ministries, schemes, revised estimates for 23-24 for different departments, ministries, budget estimates again for 23-24, and you will have the budget estimates for 24-25. So these are some of the broader heads. Apart from that, each of this column that I'm talking about, the set of data in each of these columns, will again be divided into revenue expenditure and capital expenditure. Revenue expenditure is recurring expenditure, day to day. It keeps on happening. While capital expenditure is again one-time thing. For instance, if you are spending on infrastructure, right, it will be part of that capital expenditure. You will not get immediate returns out of it. Maybe in the long run you'll get the returns, but generally the returns are much more for the amount of money that you are spending. So you can also look at these things, right? How much capital expenditure is being incurred? How much of the total spending is revenue expenditure? If large part of your spending is revenue expenditure, then you are just meeting your day-to-day requirements. Maybe you're not.
Maybe interest payments and all.
Yeah, or interest payments, salaries, wages, they're all part of your revenue expenditure. So a large part of your expenditure, if it is revenue expenditure, that means maybe in future we might have an issue.
And also borrowings may increase.
Yeah. So also, if you look at the different rows in these documents, you can see some rows which are under central schemes, some rows which will be under centrally sponsored schemes. Now, that also gives you an idea. Central schemes means something which is completely funded by the union government. Centrally sponsored schemes, again, these are the ones where the union and the states together both have to contribute. The states, again, there are some conditionalities. So that way also you can make the distinction.
Yeah. So now that you have explained these definitions of budgetary, revised, capital, etc., we need to look at the numbers per se. Okay. So we'll do that after the break. We'll take a short break now, and after the break, we'll discuss the numbers itself.
Stay tuned to All Things Policy. We'll be right back after a short commercial break.
Welcome back. We're discussing the union budget, as in the budget is not yet out, but we're discussing how we can actually look at the budget. How can we make it make more sense for us? So we were discussing some important heads and categorization in the budget documents before the break. Now we'll move on to some numbers. What are these numbers? How do we look at them? So revised, actual, you've already spoken about. So can you just take us through this?
Yeah. So generally the discussion is around the budget estimates. So next year, how much the government is going to spend on this sector or on the scheme, or how much is going to be the allocation for a particular department, ministry. Now, yeah, I mean, these numbers are important, but we should always look at the context. Or for instance, right, we should look at these numbers in relation to the revised estimates, in relation to the actual expenditure. For instance, last year, maybe the budget estimates for a particular ministry was X, and the revised estimate is maybe 50% of X.
Yeah, which means you've not spent enough.
And this year you are announcing Y. So maybe Y will not be even spent, because given the historical data, it shows that you are not able to spend whatever was being allocated to you. So look at the context over there. Also, maybe compare it with the actual expenditure. That gives you even a more realistic number. So if budget estimate last year was X and this year it is Y, maybe Y is 20% higher than X, we should not assume that this time the budget reallocation has just increased by 20%, so everything will be 20% higher. Might not be the case. Maybe you are spending even less. So keep that in mind. Look at the context.
Yeah. So what you're saying is that just because scheme or a particular sector has been allocated X, it doesn't mean anything. You have to look at it in the context of how much was actually spent 2 years before and how much was the revised estimate for last year.
I mean, make a, basically you are trying to do some sort of intelligent estimation here, right? Apart from this, there is a possibility that there will be increase in allocation in the outlay for different departments and ministry. Now, let's say there is a 5% or 4% increase in allocation for a particular department ministry. Now, does it really mean that the ministry or department now has higher amount of resources, it can spend more? What do you think, Suman?
Maybe not. If you take into consideration like inflation and things, it might just be adding up to the
exactly
same
right. If the inflation rate is more than that, and your allocation increases percentages less than that, then doesn't make, I mean, effectively
it nullifies,
right? I mean, in fact, you might be getting less. You might be able to do less as compared to last year, right? Let's say the inflation rate is 6% and the increase in allocation is 5%, right? You are now having lesser resources. Another way to look at these percentage increase, look at how much the overall budget is increasing, what percentage it is increasing, and look at what is the percentage increase in allocation for a particular sector or for a particular department ministry. If the overall budget is increasing at a higher percentage, at a higher rate, let's say at maybe 10%, and for that department the increase in allocation is maybe 8%, so it indirectly implies that the department is actually getting a lesser share, right? So that way also you can compare. Another aspect that you can also look for is what is the size of allocation to that scheme or department or to a ministry. If it is very small, right? If it is, let's say in the order of 500 crores or something, maybe we should not be giving too much attention to that, because it is the union budget, and look at the number of stakeholders. So something like a 500 crore might not make much of a difference. So maybe focus on the larger numbers instead of the smaller ones.
So any scheme that has, say, a ballpark 5,000 crore is what you should be.
Exactly. To have any tangible impact, right? It should have at least these kind of numbers.
Yeah. So we've covered most of this. And are there any other interesting insights that we, as general interested people, can get from the budget, and what other tips that you can offer to actually look through this budget?
So few more things that you can look at is you should look at revenue expenditure and capital expenditure, right? How much of the budget is revenue, how much of the expenditure is revenue expenditure, how much of it is capital expenditure, and what is the trend, at least for the last 2-3 years, right? Whether the capital expenditure has increased or not. So that is one aspect. Another thing is, some expenditure the government has to incur, right? I mean, irrespective of circumstances, they have to incur. These are called committed expenditure. They have to spend. For instance, the government has borrowed money, it has to pay the interest. Then to the different government officials, right? It has to pay salaries, wages. So these are all committed expenditure. You can't not stop these kind of payments. So what is the trend in terms of committed expenditure?
Is it increasing?
And of course, you should not look at it in absolute terms. You should rather take a ratio of committed expenditure to whatever revenue you are able to generate, revenue receipts. If committed expenditure to revenue receipts, it is increasing, it shows that your spending on all these things has increased, but you are not having enough revenue to meet these kind of requirements. So in future, you might have a problem. So the committed expenditure to revenue receipts ratio is important. Maybe have a look at this. And given that there have been countries in the neighborhood that have faced these kind of issues. Apart from that, the different deficit numbers are also important, right? Fiscal deficit and all those things. The budget documents give you an idea about this. Outstanding liabilities, you get an idea about this. Maybe look at these numbers. These can be prompts to maybe write a blog or write an opinion piece. And also, there can be some fundamental questions that you might raise when you look at these numbers, when you glance through these numbers, or you glance through these heads. For instance, maybe the government is spending on a particular scheme. You might have a fundamental question.
Okay.
Should the government even be having this scheme?
Okay.
Should the government be doing this? Something that we have talked about it in multiple podcasts, not just us, many others would have also talked about it. Is the government trying to address a market failure in the sector? Is there a market failure?
Yeah.
Why is the government here?
Okay.
Right. So again, Econ 101, information asymmetry, externalities, public goods, right? Concentration of market power. These are the areas where the government should be there, right? If there is a scheme which is trying to address something where there is no
already market players,
this market is doing well, then maybe it's not apt, right? We can have those questions. Also, since we are discussing the union budget, and as we know, the Constitution has provisions, right? It has different lists. The union is supposed to legislate on subjects in the union list. The state is supposed to legislate on subjects which are in the state list, and then you have a concurrent list. So there can be many items on which the union government
is actually legislating.
Is having schemes, spending money on that. Maybe the government has a decreased allocation in these sectors, the union government.
Okay.
Then it might not necessarily be a bad thing, because ideally it is the states which is supposed to do that. Right? So you can also get an idea about all these things, right? Whether if there is a scheme which is supposed to be, or if there is a scheme in a sector which is supposed to be under the ambit of the state government, then you can have a question that why is the union government doing all these things?
Yeah.
Right, and vice versa. Right, if the union government has decreased allocation to a particular sector,
say defense.
Yeah. No, not defense. I'm talking about some topics which are ideally subjects which are ideally on the state list, and the union government has reduced allocation over there.
That would be good, right?
That might be good. I mean, that need not necessarily be harm. I mean, we should not be unnecessarily criticizing the union government over there. So yeah, I mean, these are some interesting insights that you can possibly have.
Yeah. To actually wind up, the last, just a few tips, if you can just close with it, it'll be great.
Yeah, one thing. So since there's a lot of focus on union budget, and there's a possibility of big announcement, which again is less because this is going to be an interim budget. But whenever announcements are made, just try to look for what kind of numbers are being quoted. Is the union finance minister talking in terms of absolute numbers or relative numbers? For instance, is the finance minister saying 1,000 crores will be allocated to a particular ministry, or 1,000 crore increase in allocation is there, or this percentage increase is there? Usually whenever you have small increases, right, absolute numbers are quoted, and whenever you have a decent increase, percentages are quoted. So I thought this is an interesting insight, and this was there in Pramit Bhattacharya's article, I think on LiveMint. So yeah, I mean, we keep a note of these things.
Okay. Yeah. So this is interesting, and this gives our listeners and all of us a unique way to look at the budget that's coming up. So I hope everybody will keep this in mind when you're reading the budget numbers, and just not look at tax cuts, tax rate cuts, or duties, or any of that. We'll stop here for this episode. Hopefully come back later with an analysis of the actual budget that comes out. And to close this session, I just like to tell our listeners about the various courses we offer at Takshashila's Public Policy School. We have the Graduate Certificate in Public Policy. We have the Postgraduate Program in Public Policy. We also have a new initiative which is called the Open Takshashila. It is our endeavor to make public policy accessible and easy for everyone. So you can check this out, where this is a platform where we have policy discussions, where we have events, where we have open courses that we run. So look at opentakshashila.net and join us there for more interesting conversations on these topics. Thank you, Sarthak.
Thanks, Suman.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.